Okay. Alright. Is this where All right, we're fine.
I got, when got Dr. Bill and him there, and Greg Ellis, supposed to be on, y'all ask as many questions as you want. It doesn't even have to pertain to the pool.
Yeah, they.
You want to talk about whatever you want, that's what you're here for.
Okay.
We'll go over a little bit about that last deal about moving that well or whatever. Dr. Bill will have more information on, as a geologist, about where you may put that, even if it's doable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
As far as what quality of water you would come up with, anything.
I was really hoping Randy would be here. Kind of a thing. It's like,
And we can get all those questions back to him and then he already had a prior engagement, but I do have some questions for Dr. Hutchinson based on some of the things that he said in their latest meeting. It sounds like they've got some newer information that will be helpful in trying to figure all that out.
well, I guess Lisa will start it and then I'll just kind of give maybe an introduction and then I'll let you start out asking questions and then we'll kind of go from there. Is that okay?
All right. Let's do a little. Bring the workshop to order. The board has a quorum. And one maybe on the way. So, I'd just like to say real quickly, this is a workshop around the table, and there will not be any chance for questions or participation from the audience. We just ask you all to not chatter too much amongst yourselves. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. A little short statement just so that everybody kind of know how we got here today. For all in attendance and watching online, this is a workshop where your elected officials across numerous organizations are willing to sit together as a team and discuss ideas and solutions. And in my humble opinion, that is an awesome thing. I think a lot more of this needs to happen within this county, and we would like to exercise that today. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. The FCSA Board of Directors is hosting this meeting. No votes are going to happen today. No decisions will be made. This is just a workshop to get people around the table and talk. And I think throughout life, I've learned to try to be a lot more curious and a lot less aggressive towards an answer and just get as much information as you can get. It certainly served me a lot better than my former self. And I think that I'll always continue to work towards that. And I think this is a big step towards us working towards that. But I think everybody should understand how we got here today. And this started with an idea for the pool, an invitation from Kinney County Groundwater District to discuss an idea further with several board members. This invitation was presented publicly on June 15, 2024 at a regular monthly FCSA board meeting. And on July 12th, 2024, representatives of the FCSA had that discussion with several representatives of the Kinney County Groundwater District. And through that conversation, some of my new ideas were presented. As a group, we believe it would be best to continue this discussion at a workshop meeting where we in the Groundwater District and MUD could all attend. And so here we are today. We have a lot of people dedicating their time to this workshop, so please make sure that we're all respectful. And if you brought any vegetables, don't throw them at me. But let's get started.
Let's go around for anybody that doesn't know anybody.
Yeah.
And for
Yeah,
we've
that'd be
got
great. Yeah.
BJ. Can't hear you. You're on mute. She's muted.
The joys of Zoom.
Okay, I'm off mute.
Okay.
Yes,
So-
I apologize for not being there. I'm sick. But anyway, I am BJ Eckenrod. You want to just a little background?
Sure.
Is that what you're asking?
Sure.
Okay. I'm on the Mud Board and the Kinney County Groundwater.
Him to adjust that camera to get
for
us in here.
both.
He's got more
And,
of a crowd in there
I'm
than us.
just here to hear what everyone says.
Which one? This one?
Thanks, BJ.
I don't know, but
Okay.
Mr. Hutchinson.
You're on mute, Bill.
all that we can see is
Hi, I'm Bill Hutchinson. I'm a consultant with the Groundwater District. I was asked to attend by Zoom.
Thank you.
I'm Randy Schott. I'm a director with the Groundwater District.
Thank you.
Blake Ward, I'm a director with the Groundwater District.
Matt Lamb, Director, Groundwater District.
Around and look at the people.
I think everybody knows.
Everybody knows that.
Private COA director with Fort Clark Mud.
Jason Long, Fort Clark Springs director.
John Wiley, Fort Clark Springs director.
Lisa Vale, Fort Clark Springs director. I really only have water.
Charlene Calendar, general manager.
Okay, what do you got, Travis?
So there were a couple of ideas that I think came from the conversations that were had between the association and the water district. And just for reference as to how this is set up. So Fort Clark Mud is the in charge of putting the fresh water and the sewage for Fort Clark. Just so happens that the bounds of the Fort Clark Mud District are the same as the bounds as the association property. And so we're in charge with the fresh water and your sewage system, and also the sewage system for the city of Brackettville, which is done on the back of the FCSA property on an 80-acre plot. We are also a permit holder from the groundwater district. So that's how we kind of tie in. So the association has the property and the governance of the association in those grounds. We sit as the governance of the freshwater and sewage system with a permit from the groundwater district. So that's kind of where we play into this. I think some of the ideas have been around the mud well system and working with those and looking at what they can do. So that's where a lot of my questions come from. And so I think that thank you all for bringing Dr. Hutchinson to be with us. I think he's got most of the answers that will at least get us started. Dr. Hutchinson, thank you for being with us today. So that I think several of these ideas have to do with the mud wells in general. So just kind of a baseline couple of questions that I've heard you talk about in meetings, and maybe we can get an update on where they sit. So what is the correlation of the FC mud well system to the Los Moras spring flow? I know I've seen the charts that you presented in the meetings. And so could you tell us a little bit about that correlation?
Yeah, based on monitoring that we've been doing for the last 10 or 11 years, one of the wells that we monitor has been the city well what we call the city well number 1. It's the one that doesn't use that much. It correlates very well with the spring flow. Now, more recently, we've installed an instrument in the mud well. Before we couldn't get in there, there was a physical obstruction, or we needed a smaller instrument, basically. And we finally got access to that. I think it was late last year. And we've been collecting data on that. And that, at least on the limited data that we've got, that looks like it acts just like the city well and is very well correlated with the spring flow.
Okay. And is there, and so when you say very well correlated, that means that we are in management zone 1 as it's currently, as you currently see management zone 1. And I know that this is an evolving science, but currently we are in management zone 1.
Right. Management zone 1 is based on what we put together in the fall of 22. We based that on the correlations between water levels and spring flow. And so yes, those two are in management zone 1 and are probably the two best or two most highly correlated wells with the spring.
Okay, thank you. So that was kind of the baseline. I think if that's the reason for the conversations of looking at the mud wells or any solutions that are involving that, I think it's important to understand the science side of it is that these are highly correlated wells to the spring system. So those were the questions I wanted to start with from a mud perspective with Dr. Hutchinson.
Okay. You have anything?
At the moment.
Mr. Hutchinson, I think I have a couple of questions for you here. The other day, you're probably not going to be able to see this, Blake. I don't know. Is he familiar with this graph?
Yeah, and I've actually got those Here too. Don't
Okay.
top.
You gave us this graph the other day. I didn't really have time to digest it. After the meeting, I looked at it for a while and tried to wrap my head around it. And I believe it was Jason that said at this time the spring was not flowing, correct?
Yeah.
On this graph.
I guess so. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, this is what we talked about. You just forgotten. So on whatever it was like 320, I believe, something like that, spring was not flowing. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Hutchinson, there was no head pressure because if there's no spring flows, there's no head pressure. Is that correct?
That is not correct.
Okay. Can you?
All it means is that the pressure is defined as any water that rises above the top of the aquifer. Now, the top of the aquifer in the area around Brackettville and Fort Clark is, it's on the order of at least 200 feet. So what's happening is water is being, when rain falls in the northern end of the county and north of the county, it recharges the Edwards aquifer. That water then moves down gradient, downhill, and pressurizes the confined portion of the Edwards aquifer. When that pressure is sufficient to cause the water to rise above the ground surface, you get a spring, or at the dueling well, you get a flowing well. But just because the water level in the spring drops below the top of the land surface, or below the top of the pipe at the dueling well, doesn't mean that pressure is just reduced. There's still pressure.
Okay. Thank you. That clarifies that. So let me restate my assumption. There's not enough head pressure for the spring to flow. Would that be accurate?
That is correct.
Okay. So there's not enough head pressure for the spring to flow. Wouldn't that make sense that when mud turns their well on, that due to the lack of head pressure, that it would have an extreme correlation? I don't know if that word would be accurate, but it would have an exaggerated correlation with the dipping of the water in the spring, as opposed to when you have higher head pressure?
Well, one of the things that we see in our data, the data that we collect in the transducers is collected I think some of them some's got them turned on, some of them on every 15 minutes and some every hour. I think the one at the city well is on every hour, and I think the one at the mud well is on every 15 minutes. I may be wrong on that.
That's correct.
Either way, what we see is that every time the well is turned on, the water level drops. As soon as the well is turned off, the water level bounces right back to where it was. Over the long term, over weeks and months, then you'll start seeing declines or rises depending on what else is going on. But the actual operation of the well has minimal effect and a very temporary effect of just when that well is on. So in other words, what we do not see a very big drop in the spring pressure. One of the things that y'all allowed us to do late last year was install an instrument, a pressure transducer in the spring pool itself. That's given us a lot of information on what happens when each of the wells is turned on, and we can see small changes in that pool. Once the spring is flowing, that pool fills up and it doesn't change very much. But when it goes below the ground surface, we do see some changes. So when the well is operated on a daily basis, we see little fluctuations in the spring pool. Not very much, but at that point, the spring was already dry, so we could see those changes. So I don't think the operation of the well is the critical thing. The critical thing is we're in the 5th year of a drought, and we're seeing water levels everywhere drop, and then we saw the big reversal back on July 23rd with the big rain. Everything started to rise.
Okay, thank you. So am I deducing that essentially that you're I don't know if I hear you saying this or not, but are you saying that our impact on the aquifer is so minimal that it wouldn't even necessarily be a good idea to dig another or drill another well for in the Austin Chalk for drinking water?
Well,
It would-
that's a different question. You've got a couple of things to think about. Some of them are kind of short term and some of them are kind of long term. What we've seen during this drought is the springs dried up for extended periods of time for the last, 2-3 years? Yeah, almost 3 years now. There is a pipeline from the mud well to fill the pool up, but it costs money. But over that short period of time, you can operate that well essentially once a week, kind of like the spring diversion, and fill it up. My understanding is it costs like $600 every time you fill the pool up. So you could run the pool, drop it, dump it, fill it back up with the well. And that effect of that 3 acre-feet or whatever it is per week, essentially, would not have any long-term effects on the spring. That seems like a fairly low-cost, short-term fix on the economic impact of not having the pool. A longer-term solution is what I'd heard talked about was drilling an Austin Chalk well that would not have any direct influence on the spring. But that requires figuring out where to put the well, how to pay for a very expensive well and the power and all that sort of thing. I'm not so sure I'd have to run the numbers, but I don't know if the economics of that work out as well as just filling the pool up with the mud well as it is.
Thank you. I guess you answered a lot of questions. I guess what I'm getting at is I really, we all want to formulate an opinion here. I've heard you mention drought a couple times. We all know that we're in somewhat of a drought, but I have a question for the groundwater board is how come this graph spurs new ideas and it spurs the groundwater board into action, but there's a graph and I don't have it. We're all familiar with it. The one where it shows over the course of a few years increase in pumping and decrease of spring flow. Why does that graph not give all of us the heebie-jeebies, but this graph does?
Well, that monitor was just put in March, I believe. Dr. Bill said late last year, but it was March. So with the newfound evidence, what ends up happening is if you start regulating without regulating the zone number one wells, it opens you up for litigation where people can, I guess is the right term, come in, step in, sue you. And I visited with 2 different attorneys, not only our own, and they said they win. So that's where we're at. It's not that we haven't been paying attention to it. We have, but how do you regulate without regulating the most influence on the spring, negative influence on the spring? How do I go to a well 10 miles away and say, can't do that?
But you're only making that assumption based off of when we don't even have enough head pressure for the spring to flow out of the pool. And I'm not talking about the swimming pool. I'm just talking about this pool itself, which that's just been verified, right? There's a reduced amount of spring pressure, a head pressure, to the point that the creek, well, I don't care about the pool. I mean, I care about the pool as an individual, but I'm just talking about the health of the aquifer. So when I say it's the spring coming out in the pool, don't confuse the two. But the water coming out into the creek, how come we're drawing a conclusion that our well has that great of an impact when there's not enough head pressure for it to even be flowing? When this data comes from, where this data comes from?
I don't think that it's just your well. First of all, it's 4 wells that are located in the basin.
And you're talking the ones that you were talking about
The
in
city
town.
wells. Yeah, it's a combination of all of them. But like I said, we take this to an attorney's office or to a court of law, and we say the police people that are pumping water, if you want to call them pumpers, irrigators, farmers, whatever you want to call them, we say, look at this. Their wells are located 60 feet away. It's not that we're against regulation.
We just have to have the evidence to back it. Does that make sense? Like,
No, that makes perfect
it's
sense.
here. I mean, we lose.
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is that, I went to my Bandera office and talked to the water board there, and I'm not saying that, I'm going to attempt to not compare the two. But I just asked a question. I just said, are y'all used to being sued? He said, every day. We get sued all the time. It's just a constant battle. And I was like, well, tell me, what do you do? And they said, well, we have somebody come in, they clear land, they want to irrigate it, or they build a subdivision, they do test wells. I'm very familiar with that. And we say, this is how many acre foot a year you're able to use. They get mad about it because it doesn't suit their needs, and they sue us. I didn't really inquire as to whether they win or they lose. I was more inquiring on the fact that it's common, right? How do they regulate? And they're still regulating. They're still doing it, right? They still get the requests and they're still saying, no, you're going to get, it doesn't really matter the number, 30 acre feet, doesn't matter. But they still regulate.
New applications.
Right. New applications. And that is different than a historical application. But they're regulating and they're getting sued. And is that I'm not familiar with all this. I'm very curious. So is the distinction just that it's a new or existing application and their rights are somewhat different? Because if you own the land and you have right of capture, and I don't know this, so I genuinely am being honest about that. If you have right of capture over here for a gentleman that he's had a farm for 10 years, he has a permitted well for 100 acre feet. Another gentleman over here says, well, I want to get into that business. Looks like it makes a lot of money. And he wants to do the same thing. And they restrict his rights. But he doesn't he have the same right of capture?
Right of capture and permits are two different things, though.
Okay.
Your permitted allotted
Educate
rights.
me.
Your permitted allotted rights are what? These were all established during I call them the water wars.
Yeah. The early 2000s.
Let's say that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So these were all established before this board. I don't think any member of this board was on them. Were you, Matt? No. And
He just looks like he was on it.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to offend you there. But so all this was established. So there's 74,000, 76,000 allotted acre feet in Kinney County, right?
Right.
We have had nothing to do with that. But if somebody else comes in, say that you buy, just like you said, you buy a farm next to us and you want to do this, do that.
Yeah.
I don't have any water rights with my property. I own 100 acres. I have no water rights with it. Now I have right of capture, which Dr. Bill will probably have to explain right of capture a little better than I am. But right of capture to me seems like any runoff, tank water, anything like that, reservoir water, you can catch that and hold it back. But as far as just drilling a well and saying, this is mine, you can only do that with a domestic exempt well.
Okay.
And Janelle can probably enlighten us on that too.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important, maybe we can ask Dr. Hutchinson about this. So as a permit holder, when we were granted our permit as MUD and all of the other permit holders were put into that pool, that is when the historic use permits were put in, right? And so at that point is when the litigation started. And so what you're talking about, the litigation that you're talking about and the litigation that the district has gone through and has already been decided in the court of law is much different than what you're talking about from my understanding. And, what I wanted to ask Dr. Hutchinson was, Dr. Hutchinson, how far back would you say that the litigation process set the science of the water district during that time? Or maybe Janelle can talk to us.
Well, yeah, when the district was formed and they went through this process of perfecting the existing and historic uses and granting permits on that basis, the district was spending all of its money on lawyers fighting everything in court. When Peggy Sue Postel got elected president in 2012, that's when things finally quieted down and we were able to spend money on putting in these instruments and actually getting data. That was one of the biggest goals from the beginning when Jim and I started working for the district. Going back to your rule of capture is the default groundwater law in Texas. That was established in 1904, whatever it was, with the East case. Groundwater districts are now the preferred method of groundwater management. That's in Chapter 36 of the Water Code. And groundwater districts have the authority to modify the rule of capture. They can require wells to be spaced. They can put production limits on wells, so on and so forth. They can regulate groundwater. So the rule of capture doesn't really exist in Kinney County because there's a groundwater district. And what happened 20 years ago was a system was set up where existing and historic uses were permitted. And there's a process now for new permits. People can apply for new permits. And then you go through a whole process on that. What I heard about with Bandera County, they're talking about new permits that are coming in. There haven't been any new permits applied for in Kinney County in many, many years. So that's not really applicable here. And so what we're talking about are the existing and historic uses, like Fort Clark Mud has one of them. And Bracketville is not regulated. And the irrigators are, they have permits. And so the rule of capture doesn't really apply. Now, the one exception, and Blake brought this up, there are things called exempt wells. If you have an exempt well, it's actually an exempt use. Uses that are exempt from permitting are domestic, your house well, and livestock wells. So those don't require any permit, but they're relatively small uses. So when we're talking about permits, we're talking about the 115 or so wells that have permits in the county, and all of those have established existing and historic rights that were established back 20 years ago.
So, Mr. Hutchinson, are we over permitted in Kinney County?
Well, that's a loaded term. If you mean by that, you mean the recent use has been much less than the permit amount. If you want to define it that way, then yes. The existing and historic uses were established through a rather complicated process where folks had to come in and prove up the amount of water that they used. And even if you used it 1 year out of 20, then that's the right. You essentially got the maximum amount. So the thing, basically what's happened is that folks were able to prove up 70-some thousand acre feet of uses. But in recent years, pumping has been about 5,000 acre feet, but in the last couple of years, it's bumped up to about 10 or 11,000 acre feet. So it makes management difficult because what happens if everybody wanted to start using their full permit amount? That's where we could run into problems.
So, thank you, Mr. Hutchinson.
Let me ask this real quick. Is there a level? I don't know if there's a level that's been determined. You said 76,000. Is that correct?
It's some number there. It's in the 70,000 range.
Okay,
that's what's been permitted.
Is there a level in there, like if people started moving toward their limits, so to speak? Is there a level in there where we really get in trouble? I mean, is that something that's been researched?
Yeah, that's exactly what we've been doing. I went through this in a very lengthy presentation last September, where I talked all about these kinds of issues and looked at the permit totals, historic uses, how many of the permits, have used essentially zero out of their permit, how many have used a fair amount, how many have come very close to exceeding their permit. Every permit's a little different. So it just depends on where you are, which property you're talking about. Now, at the point that I had the data last fall, basically what I was trying to do is get a handle on looking at it from a total pumping standpoint. And the goal, the planning goal, management goal of the groundwater district is to maintain historic spring flow, historic in the sense of the last, I think we went back to like sometime in the 1950s. Now we recognize that spring is going to be high flow high in the wet years and flow very little in the wet years. But on average, it should be maintained. The pumping should be managed to maintain that spring flow. The bottom line is that if people were to start approaching their permit limit, you would not be able to maintain that spring flow. And it has not been a problem because the last 30 or 40 years, pumping has not been anywhere near the level of the permit. Like I said, the pumping has generally been in the 4,000 to 5,000 acre foot a year range, which has not caused any problem with maintaining spring flow on an average basis that was basically what it's always been since the 50s. So if pumping were to increase off of that amount, we've seen that in the last couple of years, yeah, then there may be problems associated with maintaining spring flow at historic amounts. And so that's one of the objectives of all this work that we've been doing, is to get a better handle on what that inflection point would be, because the next round of desired future conditions, the joint planning process, the next round is due for approval in May of 26. So we basically have a year and a half to start working through that process. So we're trying to get our work done so we can spend 2025 looking at all the different options and what all the implications of those options are.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with, I'm glad you brought up the DFC, because I just want to be educated on it, want to try to wrap my brain around it a little bit. I'll read a little section here. The DFC is proposed to the basis of the Edwards Aquifer in Kinney County is hydrologically a classic karst aquifer with temporally variable inflows. I had to look that up, time variable inflows from various recharge sources and major natural discharge points at Lost Moors, Pinto, and Mud Springs, and are also temporally variable with aquifer conditions. And I find this next sentence very interesting. This hydraulic condition denotes that it is highly vulnerable to drought and water supplies are substantially adversely affected by drought. Are drought and extraction synonymous?
Or what?
Are drought and extraction synonymous?
No, well, they're drought means low rainfall. Extractions means pumping. And typically in a drought period, there's going to be more pumping because the irrigation demand is increasing. So they're linked, but in a lot of cases, in a lot of areas, pumping will happen whether there's a drought or not. But in this, for irrigation purposes, excuse me, there is a link, but they can be independent.
Okay, so in the new proposed rules, there is, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a permit application for exempt well category for 50 acre feet for new wells. Correct? And then,
I remember seeing, yes. I
yeah,
remember that.
and then Fort Clark uses, 650 acre feet.
About 650 acres.
And the city,
Numbers,
the
yes.
city's about 650 roughly.
We'd guess that they'd be about the same.
So we're talking 26 to 27 wells, and we would meet the requirements of the city and the fort.
I'm sorry, what?
With 26 to, we'll just call it 25 to 30 wells, in theory, 50 acre permitted wells, they would match that of what the fort and the city potentially
Yes.
use.
Yeah.
I don't understand where you're getting the.
You mean non-permitted?
Non-permitted.
Yeah, well, non-permitted.
He's just saying that the amount would equal, if
The
you drill
amount would
50
equal-
new wells, it would equal 1,500 acre feet
The 50 acre foot limit. There's the current Kinney County rules. You have to go through a fairly elaborate process to get a permit. And the 50 acre foot limit in there is to get a permit, but not go through quite the same level of review and analysis that would be needed for something over 50 acres. My original recommendation was 100, and it was dropped down to 50. And it was simply a way that if someone wanted to open up a welding shop or something and drill a well, they wouldn't have to go through the same rigorous and expensive analysis that would be needed for a bigger well. Recognizing that the small well wasn't going to have any direct impact. Now, there was some discussion at the Rules Committee to make sure that that would not create a situation where folks would come in and ask for 8 40 acre foot wells, because clearly the cumulative effect of that would be, the same as a 300 acre foot well. So at this point, folks could come in and drill exempt wells, and there's no permit, there's no review, no nothing. So I would avoid trying to play numbers games and stacking water, because that is not the intent. The intent was to try and avoid a small well owner from going through something that would not yield anything meaningful, because the well would have virtually no impact on anything because of its small amount of income.
Was that your question there?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think for in layman terms, right? If we all see, if somebody's concerned, they see, well, there's a 50 acre foot well. I think that just needs to be explained or orated, maybe. Like if a subdivision came in and they wanted to cut up 10 acre lots, and I'm just going to use this as an example. That's what this would be used for. These types of wells.
No. If someone came into the subdivision and each lot was greater than 10 acres, each lot owner would be provided the opportunity to drill an exempt well. That's not a permitted amount. That's not a permitting process. That's just something that anybody can do. So that has nothing to do with this. This would be for a commercial well. A permitted well is for commercial purposes or irrigation purposes, not for domestic or livestock.
Okay, I understand.
Anybody can come in and file paperwork and drill a livestock well or a domestic well, and that's all there is. It's just filing the paperwork that they are drilling a well because they have the right to do that.
Okay.
And so subdivisions of lots greater than 10 acres, that would come under the exempt well category.
And the county's actually stepped in. They're passing a lot of regulation on subdivisions, and they did it, I think, last year. And I don't know what you can look it up, I'm sure, or ask, but they put new restrictions on it to try and protect the amount of use, because what was ended up happening is there were so many wells in the line in Edwards County that they were greatly affecting each other.
So then I guess, why are we creating a new 50-foot exempt well category?
Just like what you just said.
Just for like commercial entities to be able to open up shop?
No.
Not on water, but like you use a welding shop as an example. So I'm not saying on water.
It was just an example. The idea was that the process to get a new permit is very, very expensive. And so for a small well, a well that wouldn't produce that much water, the idea is to balance going through all that expense versus real potential for having an impact on somebody. If someone comes in and wants to produce 10 acre feet, that's not going to have an effect on anybody. So why not streamline that permitting process to make it easier for them to get that well? Why subject someone who wants to pump 10 acre feet the same as someone who wants to pump 1,000 acre feet? That's the origin of that.
Okay. I don't know who this question would be for, but could somebody help me to understand how the proposed drought condition rule conserves the aquifer, considering that it mostly recently worded, it authorizes pumping during droughts, the maximum water ever pumped by individual pumpers. Now, I may already know the answer to that based off of your litigation talk, but can y'all fill me in on that?
You read that so quick, man. You blew my mind.
Just talking about the 21-year rule of your maximum pumped in a drought year.
Yeah.
Can you just expand on that?
So basically, well, I don't have it right in front of me. You're talking about the 21-year rule. So the way that we came up with that, and that really needs to be a Dr. Bill and Greg answer on. That'd be Dr. It would be a Greg deal.
That was Greg. Oh, Greg is here.
Is he here?
Yeah. He slid back in his chair a little bit.
Because he went into it with us the other day. Was that the meeting that you read or not? John? Whenever Greg went, he went there, Greg, he went into it the other day. And it was like,
I'm here if you want me to answer the question.
absolutely.
The purpose of the proposed rule is to try to make sure things don't get worse during a drought. We don't issue any new permits. We don't expand any existing permits. We only let people pump the maximum amount that they have produced. The board decided to go back to the full history of the district because the district has reports for people on how much they produced each year from 2023 to 2020, I'm trying 2003 to 2024. Now, the reason that we would allow the maximum amount is to avoid litigating takings claims, where if we limit someone to less than the amount that they have been producing, that could potentially cause economic damage to them. And there's a potential there of litigation, certainly, and anytime there's litigation, there's always a possibility that the district won't prevail. And so the people that have invested back to expectations, that have invested in being able to produce X amount of water, would have the best chance at winning a takings claim against the district. So by allowing them to produce the maximum amount that they had ever produced, we believe that would avoid any type of takings claim. I have to tell you, if you've seen the comments that we received, at least one of the commenters is claiming that his client invested in a permit, has not produced any water under that permit for the last 20 years, but is still entitled now to that amount of water and would sue the district for takings if we limit their future production to an amount less than their permit amount. I personally don't think that's a winning argument in court. I think they're going to have a hard time proving economic damage to the property as a whole from not being able to produce water that they have never produced. But until we have those lawsuits, I can't tell you what the answer is. I don't know what the court's will. I can tell you typically groundwater conservation districts lose at the district court level, where we have elected judges facing individual landowners versus government, and the typical usual district court judge rules in favor of the landowner over the groundwater conservation district. But then we almost always win that on appeal at the appellate court level or the Supreme Court level. There have been a few cases where the district has lost, the Edwards Aquifer Authority being the biggest of those, but that was a takings claim. And that was the Bragg Pecan Farms, and that cost that district $4.5 million. Because the Bragg Pecan Farms were able to prove up in court how much they had invested in growing pecan trees and how much damage would be done to those pecan trees from the limitation on their ability to produce groundwater to the level they had expected to be able to when they planted those pecan trees. And between the damages that they proved up in court and the post-judgment interest, that ended up costing $4.5 million. So my goal as the general counsel for the district is to do everything I can to make sure that they don't end up in court. But if we do end up in court, I want to make sure I've done everything I can to be absolutely certain that we win. So this rule was designed to keep us out of court and if not, at least give us an excellent chance of being able to win whatever lawsuit gets filed.
Can I, the 21 years, was that the recommendation or just the decision? Like, was there?
That was the board discussion of the board decision. They wanted to use the full history of the district. And
Was there a recommendation?
that number's as good as any other number. I mean, my recommendation was to go back 3 or 5 years because of the current drought circumstances. It's highly likely that the people that are relying on groundwater have done so to the maximum extent over the last 3 to 5 years. But there's nothing wrong with going back 20 or 21 years. When the legislature created the Everett Aquifer Authority, they gave them a 21-year historic use period. And the worst part about that was the district wasn't there and didn't have any records of what that pumping was. So we had to try and find a way to come up with those records and trying to issue those permits. That permit process took the better part of 7 years. At that point, we had 98% of the permits issued.
Wow.
So here we already have the permits issued. We already have them reporting how much they have pumped. And we're simply setting a limit of how much of their permit they get to produce during the drought. But apparently there are people out there that have permits, have not produced any groundwater, and would therefore be told you can't produce anything during a drought.
Is that a rolling number, or once you set it, that's the number from that day? Like if it's 21 years, after 21 years, they can only look back for the last 21 years, or if it's 3 years, we're only going to consider the last 3 years, or once we set this precedent with this rule, anyone that was grandfathered in will be able to pump as much as they ever did ever when.
The rule is drafted would take effect whenever the board is declared that we were in the drought. So upon that declaration, that's when you would look back and the staff would then send everybody a letter saying this is the amount you're going to be allowed to produce while this drought continues. And that would be their limit until the drought is lifted by action of the board. So no, it would not be a rolling number. It doesn't change every year. It would be set, and then whenever the drought gets lifted, they would be able to produce their full permit amount.
So this was discussed in the groundwater district meeting on this week on Wednesday, and y'all are going to have a whole process to go through all of these rules that are being mentioned because it was like y'all needed to start over and do something like that. So, the solutions that we're talking about, we have a MUD meeting next week. So the solutions, what are the solutions that we're talking about today, or how do we get to those solutions so that we can take those back to a MUD meeting?
Well, that's a good question. I think what's also just as important in that, and I'll give you some of those. I'll ask you some of those questions. Is that we all have the ability, as elected officials, we have to be able to vote and make a decision. The same as I'll make a comment to the litigation stuff that's somewhat baffling me. I completely understand it. It sucks, but I am not comfortable making decisions on drilling a well in the Austin Chalk and then saying this is going to solve our problem if I don't have the knowledge to make that decision. And so it's just simply trying to gain that knowledge to make an educated decision. Now, for somebody, I'm not going to pick on Jason. I'm just going to jokingly make a comment that bar might be really low. He might only, I don't know, I just want this little piece of information. And for Lisa, that might be, Elon Musk level stuff. And so at the end of the day, I want to be able to make a good decision by having a clear picture of what's going on. And so I'll get to some of those questions or give you some of those answers to some of my concerns towards doing that. Mr. Ellis, I have another question for you. Well, let me start with the groundwater board. The DFC was not met last year, correct?
No, I don't think it will.
Okay. And this is the sucky part. From what I'm hearing, Mr. Ellis, correct me if I'm wrong, if the DFC is not met, then essentially every action that the groundwater board is taking currently is for its own protection. and rightfully so, to avoid litigation. So what happens when we're in the drought continues, the DFC continuously does not get met? And then what hits the fan? Do we move the goalpost, or is there ever going to be a way to solve the problem? I genuinely do not know the answer to that, right? Because if the goal of the groundwater district is, I only care about the spring flowing, I want the pool full of water, and that's some of what we're talking about. But I really care about the spring. I mean, it was here way before farmers. It was here way before capitalism. Okay, it's very important to this economy as it applies to everybody in this county, and historically for everybody outside of this county that came here to visit over the last couple hundred years. So I think what I'm hearing, just correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's almost no pathway to allow the spring to flow by managing extraction of water, because if you did that, the litigation that would ensue after that would be so immense that the groundwater district will get in trouble.
The other part of that is you may not be able to live. We may not be able to restrict enough to even have drinking water for the spring to be back.
And that's
Does that
a
make
great
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
That's what he just said.
And I understand that. So at what point, and Mr. Ellis, maybe you can answer this, at what point do you get to that spot where it's like, hey, and I'll bring up some stats. I did a little bit of research about farming, and I have nothing against farmers at all, but I'm in the capitalistic world. Now, I know you farm. Nobody farms to just put clothes on people's backs. Okay, you do it to make money. It is your form of living. And that would be like saying I clear people's land just so that they can enjoy their view. I do it to make money. It's a capitalistic choice. At the end of the day, if I don't, if that won't make me money, I end up having to do something else. So with that said, average about 30% of all of our grain, cotton, all these other things that we produce in the United States gets exported. So the argument that, well, we have to do this because these people are feeding are giving us food and providing clothing, and it's like 42% of all food produced gets wasted. So as Americans, we could do a lot better there, right? That's not an attack on you at any shape, form, or fashion. My point is how do you get to the point where you can regulate? At what point does that teeter-totter to where you say 3,000 people are more important than one? How do you overcome that as a groundwater board? And I see the mountain that you're trying to climb.
I'm not really following your argument on farming. Really not, Are you saying produce less food so you kill off people? Where are you going with this,
No, I'm not saying.
I mean,
China
I'm saying
and
produce
India.
to make money.
Yeah.
But you do the same. Everybody.
We all do. You're right.
But
if the market, my point would be not that there's anything wrong with farming, but there's an excess, we export it. And at the end of the day,
we import it at the same time. You're taking a one-sided argument.
I'm not trying to take a one-sided argument. You can educate me. I'm not trying to take I'm not trying to take a one-sided.
A lot of products, a lot of.
Sure.
And if we get in a global conflict or anything, where's your food going to be coming from? Ships coming across the ocean? They get sunk. That's one of the things you're missing here, how vitally important agriculture is to the well-being of this whole nation. I'm a small farmer, okay? I farm about 500 acres out here. Just taking an average yield, okay? If I produce 40 bushels a week, which I can do in a good year, haven't been able to do it the last couple of years, even with a little irrigation. That equates to about 700,000 loaves of bread. If it's brown bread where it's not processed as much, it's over 1 million loaves of bread that I potentially produce. I do not. Jason one time put on Facebook or so that no food is processed here. No, it isn't. My wheat goes to the port or it goes to wherever a mill is. We do not have a wheat mill in this county. On the same hand, I raise cattle. You know, I produce maybe 250 calves a year. I don't butcher them here. They are shipped. I sell them at an auction here in Uvalde, Junction, Fredericksburg, Honda. Then they go to, usually they go to a backgrounder. So they're out of my hands, okay, at 500 pounds. When they get there, then they're run on a wheat pasture, Sudan or coastal. They get them up to about 750. They go to a feedlot. And then they're processed. But there's a lot of production here in this county that I don't think people are considering. It's spun as this county has quit farming, quit ranching, you know. It's not true. There's a lot of us do it.
Yeah,
And we
I know.
try to do it successfully. And how do you? Yes, there is grain exported. There is cotton exported, you know. But there's also a ton of product comes into this country. A lot of our produce comes from right across Mexico. What a lot of people forget is we have strict rules here on production. We can't spray toxic chemicals on everything. But when you go to a foreign country, they can use chemicals we do not use. That's just, you know, and as an ag producer, I'm tired of being made out to be a bad guy because I'm trying to make a living off the land. And
I don't think you're a bad guy.
well, you know, your question about where do we balance it from?
And that's my point, is where do we balance it?
We need to keep producing.
But what if, my question is if what if the DFC can never be met, but yet we keep producing? How do we solve that? Genuinely, how do we solve that?
So this is where we're trying to go with it, which everybody seems to be off in a la land. I'm going to put it that way. Once we through data, through science, you get the direct zone of where the water's coming into this spring, then you know exactly which wells affect that spring. Not everybody in general is affecting the spring. Everybody in general is not affecting the spring. And that's where the biggest argument that you're going to come in on. So you get letters from lawyers coming in here. So when you go back in history, when the groundwater was set, this district was set, there were certain individuals in certain areas that got their own hydrologists and said that water did not affect this spring at all. So that's where you're getting that one part is coming from those people, which have no effect on this spring at all. We still haven't sat down to actually see in that zone actually who the people are that directly affect the spring. That's what we're working on now to try to come up with in December. But yes, you can meet that goal if you know what you're doing. That's what we're trying to get to. So, but it isn't coming fast enough for everybody to want, oh yeah, we need this right now. And that's where everybody's at. Everybody needs it right now. The science will continue no matter what happens here.
Right.
But I think you're able to control it. Yes, I think there's a way to do that. Once you find those variables, you're able to do that.
So the science comes in and it highlights, you know, where the biggest impact is. Will there be discussion then?
Excuse me, I'm sorry, that's one of the biggest things that we're doing right now, but I think the discussion is going, or would benefit from a little historical context of the DFC. Because there seems to be an assumption that because it was not met last year, it can never be met again, and that's basically not true. So the whole concept of DFCs and joint planning came up in the legislature in 2005. HB 1763 was, and provided that every groundwater management area establish desired future conditions for its area by September 1st of 2010. So the first DFC was established in 2010. And each GMA, there's 16 GMAs in the state, and they're collections of groundwater districts. Kinney County sits in two different GMAs, GMA 10 and GMA 7. Moras Spring is in GMA 7. So the board at that time, back in 2009 and 2010, decided they wanted to set a DFC that protected historic spring flow. And we defined that, like I said, from the 1950s to 2005, I believe. That's how we established it. In 2014, so that was set up, and then the way DFCs were set up changed in 2011. In 2013, we started doing the instrumentation. In 2014, the gauge broke. Gauge was no good anymore. And it took the better part of 6-7 months for the new gauge to get built. Well, everything was based on the flow from the old gauge. And in 2013, I put together an approach to evaluate the DFC on an annual basis. The DFC is set on essentially an annual basis. So the spring flow on December 31st is compared against the rainfall from the previous year. Like I said, when it's a dry period, the spring flow is low. When it's hot, when it's wet, the spring flow is high, and we accommodate that. The problem was is when the gauge got changed in 2014, it made everything invalid. So we took when the next DFC was due in 2016, we just stayed with the old one because we didn't have anything else to do because of the change in the gauge. In 2021, we went ahead and left it the same because we were starting to get better information on the new gauge. In 2022, I redid the whole approach of tracking annual flow and annual rainfall, and that was all discussed at the management plan committee meetings in late 22. And the management plan was adopted in 2023. We're still continuing to do the work, and like I said, we're planning to update the DFC we'll start working on that in 25 when all these studies are done, so it can be adopted ahead of the deadline on May 1st of 2026. So with all that, I would encourage you to understand that just because it didn't get met 1 year, you have to look at why. And I wrote a letter a few months ago that explained all that. One was we're in the 5th year of a drought. That has not happened in the record that we were looking at when we established the DFC, and certainly not in any kind of sense of the new gauge. The second thing is that evaporation rates have gone extremely high the last 2 years, higher than ever recorded since 1954. That has resulted in higher irrigation demands and higher levels of pumping. Irrigated acreage in the county has not increased dramatically in the last 10 years. So the increase in pumping appears to be a result of the higher evaporation rates. So in the letter, I explained that if the drought continues and the high evaporation rates continue, yes, feeding the DFC will be problematic. However, if evaporation rates go back to where they had been, if we get a little rain, then there's in all likelihood the DFC on December 31st of 2024 will be met. And these are the factors that we have to incorporate into the next round of analysis for any kind of DFC update and get away from the once a year process and do it more like 4 times a year. So there's better feedback on how this all works.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Hutchinson. Travis, to some of your question, I guess let me ask Mr. Hutchinson another question about the Austin chalk. Can Can you explain to, I'm assuming you've heard of the idea of drilling the well, getting it to mud and all that. Can you just give me your overall opinion on that as, you know, somebody that's extremely intelligent with not only this region, but what's underground?
In the area of Racketville and Fort Park, the Austin Chalk is essentially the formation at the surface of the ground. And it's, like I said, between 200 and 400 or 500 feet thick, depending on where you are. Underneath that is the redwood. So the idea of the Austin Chalk well was made in order to essentially tap into a resource that is not directly connected to the Edwards Aquifer. Presumably, if you pump the Austin Chalk wells in and around Fort Clark, they will have less to minimal effect on spring flow.
Can you tell us a little bit about the water quality of the Austin Chalk?
Water quality is good. There's several irrigation wells completed in the Austin Chalk south of US 90 that have good water quality. The biggest problem is production rates vary quite a bit. And so finding a location and picking a spot and drilling a hole, it's a bit of a gamble as to whether you'll get sufficient water.
When you say good, how would you say it's good relative to the water we're pulling out of mud well right now?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's essentially fresh water.
Okay. So it's not determined whether it's better or worse. It's just
No, but if you're talking about the claims in the newspaper that it was sulfur water, that's just flat out wrong. The wells that have the bad water are deep Edwards wells in the area. They're not Austin Chalk wells. Yeah, that's just flat out incorrect.
John, I have a follow-up question too.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Hutchinson, currently the mud well system, what formation is that water coming from? The drinking water that's currently provided to the residents of Fort Clark Mud District, what formation is that water coming from?
Yeah, the mud wells are in the Edwards. They're deep wells in the Edwards.
I just wanted to see where we're changing.
Yeah, so some of my concerns with digging, say, the Austin Chalk well, which I'm hearing a little bit that there is communication between the Edwards and the Austin Chalk, which is he's saying it could have minimal or little effect, or not at all.
I'm sorry, what?
That drilling and using water out of Austin Chalk would have minimal or little effect, or no effect at all on the spring flow.
That's right.
Yeah. So that being said, the challenges that we would face is that what if we did drill a well and it had somewhat sulfur in it? Don't you have an Austin Chalk well that has some sulfur in it? And you're not that far away.
No, it is not sulfur.
No,
No sulfur.
no, none at all. My concern would be any extra equipment that we would need in order to in the event that he's saying we're taking somewhat of a gamble, right? That I don't know how expensive it would be to drill a well. Didn't you say like 300,000?
You know, and then I got thinking about it, and it may not cost as much because it's, you know, if you're 300 to 500 feet. My deal is I think of the well as a solution long term. So the groundwater district's probably spent $1 million on technology and science, I would say, so far in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? We're continually evolving. So you look at it in the scope of things and you say, well, if we can help with a well, if we can get a grant for a well, if we can apply with the Texas Water Development Board, that's why I wanted to meet tonight, because I can't go do that. Blake Ward, that's a Kinney County, I can't do that. It has to be you.
So, right. And
You know
so
what I mean?
we went to the TCEQ drinking water conference. A couple of the MUD representatives went to the TCEQ drinking water conference last week in Austin. And what I found out, I was one of the people that went, because we are keeping up with our audits, because we are keeping up with all the regulatory framework that we have to do each year, there is technical analysis that's available to us through Texas Water Development Board. So exactly what you're talking about, Blake. So if this is a question of Austin Chalk well use versus another sort of well system, Edwards, then there are steps that MUD can take to get some sort of preliminary analysis of what that would look like. And those resources are available to us because of what we do on a yearly basis. So if that's something that we want to look at, then we're, yes, that's right. We have to get the right person wearing the right hat, asking the right question. Yeah, that's why I want to.
So we use the well as technology. Say we get it paid for by the Texas Water Development, but we use it in our piggy bank of technology that we've already implemented. We can say, hey, we turn this well on and it's working. We're able to supply, but we're not able to meet demand of the Ford off of it. We need to do some more water storage, another water tower, something like that. It's not a solution that's going to happen tomorrow, but we have to think about for the future, because the thing that concerns me is we've been in arid conditions for a while. Of course, my dad and everybody that's been here for years and years said we'll come out of it. It always happens this way. But as population grows or subdivisions go in, we can see Hondo, we can see Casterville, we can see Dehennis. All that's coming this way. People can work from home. They can be out here in the middle of nowhere and do it. We hope that happens for the fort, right? Sure. We want more members. We want the fort to prosper. We want the spring to prosper. It's just a tool. And I know that $300,000 sounds like a lot of money, but in my mind, it's like those wells have been in use for 65 years. And I think my great granddad drilled them. I'm not sure, but I think he did. You know the amount of technology that we have now that they didn't have in 1955, 57, whatever year it was. So my deal is let's take steps towards doing it. If we apply for a grant, we don't get it. Well,
I mean, we can agree that the mud wells is correlated to the spring flow,
Absolutely.
but can we agree that 650 acre feet in a year coming from someone else is going to make any substantial difference in the spring's output in the time of a drought?
but it's a help.
But
And
do
once
we
we
have
get
any
that
science? You want to talk about science? Do we have any science that shows that if we move the mud well, that's going to make a significant difference to us? Dr. Bill, do we have any evidence that 650 acre feet per year was going to make a real difference if we take it out of Austin Chalk?
But y'all are the first ones in the city.
Yeah, so now you're talking 1,200
Then you
acre
start
feet,
rolling.
which if
Yeah.
you're talking about 10,000 acre feet.
I'll be in a position to answer that quantitatively by the end of the year.
All right. That's what we have been arguing for the longest time, or stating. We're getting the data. We're trying to get these zones figured out. We're getting closer and closer.
Yeah.
So if we reduce by 1,500 acre feet between the city and the fort, that's 10%. We can say that, yes, right? 10% of our annual usage. Then we start, like the bullseye we talked about, we start going out and we say, hey, this is what we found. This is where it's at.
I mean, we don't have to start in the center. We could start knocking off 10% of the county's usage or certain other zones. I mean,
We're not sure that the zones
The litigation,
are right.
they'll eat our
And-
lunch.
And some of these
Yeah, I
zones
can see that's what
look
y'all are-
like they
I
don't
get it.
affect this area. They're totally,
right,
Yeah,
okay.
and it's already
you know,
in.
there's zones that appear right now that they don't affect this. And this major rainfall event we just had, we had no improvement in my area of the county. Zilch.
From the rain.
Well, didn't come up. Y'all's well did in this area, you know.
Where are you, like south of 90 going towards Del Rio?
Yes, I'm down Pinto Creek when you cross it on 90. Yeah.
I mean, we're already getting sued. Basically, we're getting threats of lawsuits, and we didn't even
Oh,
know.
you're getting sued. I mean, you're getting sued.
It's coming no matter what, right?
Somebody's suing you.
but that's- so here's-
Probably
here's-
multiple,
so-
both sides are going to sue you.
So can I go ahead and tell you my biggest fear? This is what keeps Blakeport up at night. The groundwater district falls, we go bankrupt in lawsuits. Doesn't matter who's on the board. It's not good for Kinney County because the EAA takes control. They're probably foaming at the mouth to get control of it. Some say they are, some say they aren't. Half of a pumper's permitted rights can be sold to San Antonio.
Today?
No, it's
Yeah,
a water.
no,
it's a
it's a
water-
EAA
not
gets
today.
it.
That's why we have to work together.
Yeah.
We don't need to divide. There's so much division. And I was here. A lot of people weren't here whenever I was here. He was here whenever the water wars were going on. And Matt said it right. He said the division that was created, people wouldn't even talk to each other. People wanted to kill each other. There was threats.
It's getting pretty fired up now.
Well,
You know,
but
and
the thing about the litigation is the litigation's already happened. It's been litigated. It's been, we've gone through the process of that happening. And so that makes it almost a sure thing that all it's going to do is if we push forward to litigation, and as a permit holder, the last thing I need is the people that are directing the science, that are directing the well and what we're using to supply the fresh water, get into a no-win situation of having less dollars to then continue the science. And so it's been litigated. It was a very expensive lawsuit. And that part is almost like a non-starter. And so that's where that litigation is different. And I think you see now that the difference in those two, what you were talking about with Bandera, totally different, right? And so if we press on too fast, and I think that's why working with Dr. Hutchinson to get this science is going to open up doors that we aren't even talking about right now. When we understand the management zones, there are doors that are going to be open that aren't even on this table, that hasn't been talked about in an open session, in any sort of session of like multiple minds. I mean, so, getting there and trying to survive at that point, until then, the residents of Fort Clark, in a period from June to July, when we went from no water restrictions to stage 1 water restrictions to stage 2 water restrictions at 15%. So the overall total of the amount that we asked, the reduction, is less than 15%, right? Because 0, 10, 15 in a 30-day period. The Fort Clark Mud residents reduced their water usage by 13%. And so does that make an overall effect when you have 10,000 acre feet? No, it's a small drop in the bucket, but we're doing what we can to survive until we get this science so that we can move forward from a regulatory standpoint and also from finding solutions that are not on the table at the moment.
So let me throw a hypothetical out there. Now, it's just some of this is humorous, but let's just say that the recharge zone happens to be where the most water is coming out of the ground. What do you do then? I'm just hypothetically speaking, if that science comes back that there's this specific spot that water's coming out of the ground, and it's like, hey, that's right in the recharge zone, but they have historical use permits. I don't know if I'm saying that
right
right.
over the spring.
No, like once you find out where what is the
management
biggest
Yeah, the management,
impact
whatever. Yeah, there's too many
to
things.
Los Morris.
That's
to
where
this-
the
to
stage.
this
That's where
area.
your stages come in.
No.
Your zones.
Yeah, so you figure out your zone,
Yeah,
and then,
okay.
but you realize that this zone's charging, it's charging the spring, and then you say, well, now we're going to manage this, but it happens to be historical use permits.
But you have the evidence.
Yeah, then
You have the data.
So
And
that's
so
that's what
I'm
I was
asking. So
gonna try to
whenever,
ask, yeah.
if that data happened, and you were able to correlate that back to, hey, look, we're sorry, but the 5,000 acre feet that you're permitted, we're gonna have to cut that down to 2 because it's in the recharge zone. We can prove it now. That doesn't stop you from getting litigated, but does it protect you from being
It protects
litigated?
you from losing. That's what I'm worried about. From losing, and then they take everything we've got. If you say that the groundwater district has $5,000 in their account, and some of these people are attorneys that own property around here,
Yeah.
they can tie it up just to tie it up. We're done. And that's where the EA steps in, and that's my biggest fear.
I know, and
We-
that's what I was trying to ask earlier was if that data comes in and there is pumping in that area during a drought, are you all going to restrict it?
That's what he's formulating in the DFC and everything
That's
else.
to be determined. We do not know the answer to that yet.
Is Greg still on?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Can we ask Greg if it's possible to do, what's precedent? Has that happened in the past? Is there a situation where there's, Mr. Ellis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Is there a situation in other parts of Texas where historic use permits have been found to affect a certain situation, DFC, and then those permits be changed over time? Is that something that's happened in the past? I think that's the question, is where
No,
you're
in a
going.
drought, would there be
Okay,
restrictions?
The answer to your question is that those questions have not yet been litigated. And without the litigation, I can't tell you what the courts will do or what the final answer will be. I can tell you, Gonzales County Underground Water Conservation District originally established 2 acre-foot per acre as their permitting and issued permits to historic and non-historic users at those levels. They immediately had 5 and eventually 6 very large export projects come into the county for lease water rights from landowners and put in well fields to get producing tens of thousands of acre feet of water. As that process was going on, the board realized that the 2 acre foot per acre was not going to be a workable number by any stretch of the imagination. And in 2005, they established that originally in 2001. In 2005, they reduced that down to 1 acre foot per acre. 10 years later, as we're about to hit the statute of limitations, one of those exporters came to the district and said, not only did we lease water rights, we purchased water rights outright, and we purchased land outright to obtain the water rights. And you need to accommodate for those purchases that we made, or we're going to sue you for taking, because we want the 2 acre foot per acre that we bought. That board of directors stood up and said, we don't think you have a good case. We don't think anybody's entitled to any particular permit level. And we believe that the court will side with us. So if you're going to sue us, sue us. And the other side blinked. They didn't file that lawsuit. So I wish I could tell you I know the answer. I don't. I think that there are a lot of considerations when you're talking about these takings litigation. We're talking about a balancing test between the good you're doing for the public versus the harm you're doing to the individual. And the court has to determine who should bear the burden, who should bear the costs of what you're doing. Should it be the individual or should it be the public at large? And that'll determine who has to make those, whether we have to pay that individual or not. I can also tell you that the general law in Texas has always been the rule of capture, which means your neighbor gets to pump as much water as they want to, regardless of how much they damage you, and do so with impunity. You simply cannot sue your neighbor for those damages. That was settled in 1904, and it was backed up with a similar case in 1997 in the Cipriano, what they call the Ozarka case. At the same time, the courts are being a little bit schizophrenic because while they're saying you get to steal your neighbor's water all you want with impunity, they've also said you have a vested property right to the groundwater beneath your property. Well, I'm having a very hard time reconciling those two concepts. I don't know what that means. Okay, so if I've got a vested property right to an uncertain amount of groundwater beneath my property, that certainly means that the district is going to be subject to a takings claim if they say you cannot pump that groundwater. But the only case that's been decided on that was decided on the basis of the damage to the parcel as a whole, the whole property, not just the groundwater estate. And in that case, if you look at somebody who's never pumped any water, they're going to have a really hard time proving up damages. If I've never been pumping, if I don't have any investment in being able to produce that groundwater, if I don't have crops in the field, trees planted, a business built, something there that I've invested in that relies on that groundwater, they're going to have a very hard time winning that case, in my opinion. However, those that have invested, whether it's a utility who's put wells in, treatment plants, storage, distribution systems, or a farmer who's been drilling wells and planting crops, they do have investment in, and they have a much better potential claim to it. Those with historic use, in my opinion, have a much stronger case to make than those that don't have that historic use. Now, the other part of that equation is, what does the water code say? The water code specifically allows a district to protect historic users to the maximum extent practicable. That's the only category of use that's allowed that separate protection. And that has been used to invalidate the district's rules that were based not on historic use, but based on overall demand. There was a set of rules that were established that said everybody that's producing more than X number of million gallons a year has to follow these rules and reduce their pumping. And anybody who's pumping less than that is exempt from those requirements. And a district court judge said, you can't do that. There's nothing in the water code or your enabling act that allows you to distinguish between large pumpers versus small pumpers. Your rules have to apply to everybody equally. Unless it's based on historic use, and those rules were not based on historic use, and therefore they were found to be invalid by that court. Now, there was an appeal filed, but a later board of directors dropped the appeal. So we don't know, again, we don't know what the appellate court would have said about that decision. I know it's frustrating. Believe me, I know it's frustrating because I have to live this every single day. We just don't know what the answers are until we get those lawsuits. And I'm not eager to get those lawsuits because I'd rather keep my clients out of court.
Nobody likes
Mine too.
lawsuits.
So we've discussed a lot of potential problems and hurdles and difficulties. And the only solution we talked about is the Austin chalk, which well option. But after the groundwater meeting, I asked Dr. Hutchinson, is there any other way? And he mentioned that we could potentially get water after it came out of the ground and treat it and use that as another option. And I said, whoa, is TCEQ going to be cool with that? And he said that Greg was going to investigate that. But can both of you guys speak to that idea? Because that was novel to me. I'd never heard it before. I don't know anyone else here has considered that.
Yeah, the basic idea is that the spring is flowing most of the time. And the water that flows out of there is in excess of what Brackettville and the fort use. And so, kind of like what Del Rio does, they just divert water out of the spring after it's already started to flow out. Treat that water as surface water and distribute it as the municipal water. And when the spring goes dry, well, then you've got your wells as your backup supply. That's actually a practice called conjunctive use, where you're using surface water when it's available and using groundwater when the surface water is not available. And so during those periods of time when the spring is flowing, those wells that are most connected to the spring in Brackettville and Fort Clark would not be pumping. And so it would help prevent the spring from going dry as frequently as it happens.
But when the springs are flowing, the wells just pop all the way back up to the top. So how would us only using the wells in dire times of need not drain them way down and causes the problem that we just had the last few years?
Well, that's the thing, is that the problems are caused by lack of rain.
Yeah.
5 years of lack of rain. This is how we manage the system in El Paso. I worked there for 8 years and set up their conjunctive use program. Or kind of refined it. They use water out of the Rio Grande when it's available seasonally. And then there have been a few years when there was no water in the river. And that's when they relied more on their well. And the desalination plant was in kind of the third part of that system, because some of the wells were going salty. So we set up the desalination plant not only to treat the brackish water, but to prevent that brackish water from going into areas where there was fresh water. So it's a common municipal water system practice to, if you have surface water available, and you do in the sense of the spring flow, to use that to your benefit and let the groundwater basin rest, essentially during all those years.
I mean, are we going to hear it from downstream landowners?
It'll be due to drought, due to low rainfall, and that's when you turn your wells on.
That's why the wells were originally drilled here. There were no wells. They just drew out of the top of the spring and treated
Yeah,
it.
that's what that platform is, and the pipes that used to go into the city under Highway 90. And so that was then changed in the late 60s.
During the big drought.
Very interesting.
I don't see that drilling. I mean, this is just my perspective. I don't see that drilling one into the Austin Chalk does much of anything for us. You know, I mean, that's it. That would be a mud decision, but correct me if I'm wrong, but he said there is a correlation, but there's not that big of an effect. So drilling another one is not gonna,
He said he's gonna tell us in December how much.
well, but before that, he said, at this point, they know this area right here. Unless I misheard.
Wait, I'm
Yeah, you
understanding. Yeah,
He said
I'm
they would
understanding.
know at the end
No,
of the
but in
year.
the beginning of the conversation, he was talking about when you showed your graph with when the pump goes on, all that type of stuff. He said that doesn't have a large effect.
I think what he was saying is that so there's a tendency for wells that are located near pooling systems to draw surface water when they're turned on. And I've actually witnessed it. Russell's out here. We were both out there, and you can see once the level of the spring pond is there, when the well comes on, you can see it draw, and then when it comes off, it comes back up. And so that effect is not the same on the spring, but the correlation of the mud well use and the spring flow, there is a strong correlation to that.
Yeah, we're dealing with differences in time frames. Travis, you're exactly right. The short-term operational fluctuation of the water level in the spring and the turning on and off of the pump, that's real. Long-term, why the spring went dry was because of longer-term events like drought. And so what I was originally talking about is that once it's dry and you don't have a swimming pool, pumping it a little bit, 3 acre feet a week or whatever to fill the pool up is not going to have any big effect in terms of the long-term ability of the spring to recover. And that way the spring will come back when there's rain, which we just saw. Meanwhile, you can keep the pool filled up and operate it on a weekly basis like you have been.
I guess I'm missing
Well,
the
we
point here.
haven't, well, that wasn't my,
But I'm missing
that
the
was not
point
my
here. If you
point.
can get something that's paid for, that's a tool to help, it's paid for by a grant. Why wouldn't you take advantage of that?
Well,
Even if we
I
just fill the
don't
pool off of
see,
it.
you know, maybe I don't understand, but I don't see the help in that. Because the spring is dry. We drill a well over here. The spring's not coming back up.
But you're going to leave over time. I think what I'm understanding is that over time, if you were to use Austin chalk water instead of using Edwards water, you would leave 650 acre feet in the aquifer system every year that you're using, or every amount of time that you're using Austin chalk. Now, to that point, we also have to look at from an economic standpoint. 650 acre feet is the number we'll use. It's a little more than that. It's less than 700. But that is with a water loss rate of over 50%. So the actual consumption, when we work on the system and get our system to a point where the water loss rate is more normal, the effect of leaving the water in the ground will be less than 300, or we're right around 300 acre feet. So would it be a wiser decision for mud to look at programs to adjust the water loss to leave the water in the ground versus looking at drilling another well, or a combination of the two? I mean, having it, and
there's one aspect of that, Travis, to keep in mind is that water losses in the Fort Clark or Brackettville system, that water leaks out and goes into the Austin chalk. If you had a perfect system and you didn't have any losses, any water saving would benefit the Edwards, because that's where you're pumping it from. And any excess that you're losing, you would essentially be robbing the Austin chalk of something on the order of 300 acre feet a year of recharge, because all your water losses are actually recharging the Austin chalk.
But with the highest evaporation rates ever, those pipes aren't 100 feet under the ground. wouldn't leakage 1 or 2 feet below the ground just end up being evaporated, a lot of it, and not just go straight down more?
Well, I'm sure there's some of it is if the leaks are long-term, vegetation has grown up and is using that water.
Yeah.
But I would venture to say that a good chunk of it is working its way back down into the actual saturated zone of the Austin Chalk. But yeah, some of it's being consumed by vegetation that's dropped roots around where all the leaks are.
So we were very concerned about the water levels. We got down pretty far down into stage 3. Let's just say we had drained that thing down another 50 feet below where we did. That rain event probably would have brought it all the way back up to the top anyways, correct?
I'm sorry, I missed.
So we got all the way to stage 3 restrictions and got the mud level, what, did they on like negative 50?
We're 42-ish, 43.
42, 44
Yeah.
feet under. So what do we got down to negative 90? That rain event would have recharged even another 40 feet of drawdown.
Okay, what we saw in the storm was the mud well was down around 60 feet depth to water.
Yeah.
And in a day it popped up to 10 feet.
Yeah.
We saw the same thing in the bracket built wells. We saw, basically a 50-foot recovery. So I don't know why you would think that your pump set, I understood your pump set at about 140.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think before the storm, people thought if the water level in the mud well went down to, I think your stage 1 is 35 feet.
Yes. It right.
25.
No, I thought it was 25.
25
There was
feet.
sort of an undertone that once it hit 35 feet and you went to stage 1, my God, it's never ever going to recover. Well, then it went down to 40 and 50 and 60. And look what happened in the course of 2 days. Popped back up to 10. So I'm not convinced that even if it drew down, if the storm happened, 3 weeks later and the water level had been down to 70, you probably still see that kind of a dramatic rise. So the hydraulic systems are not that sensitive to where it starts in that sense. The only reason you might get concerned is that it starts getting down towards the point of where you're working off of your pump curve and not getting your production rate.
Right. Thank you.
All really good information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear like 3 avenues to work down, and that's drilling a well in Austin Chalk as like you describing a tool, which is obviously not a bad idea. And then are there grants available to figure out a way to put more money into y'all's hands to be able to fix the leaks through outside contractors or whatever the case may be? Because I think y'all have 3 guys or whatever.
Right. And so that's something that we're looking at. That was part of the drinking water conference that I was attending, was the financing section of that. So it's in several sessions on the financing that's available. Obviously, we've used bond measures in the past, but there's there's additional financing, there's additional technical assistance to figure that out prior. So we kind of know like what is the effect going to be if we do this. And we do have a strong idea of where we would target those systems within the water system that we currently have to fix that. So that is something that we're working on.
So the other day after our meeting, like I read a little bit about the Texas Water Board and its creation and whatever in the 60s and kind of their how it's grown over the years. And they're all about conservation and planning for the future. Up north, they've had to build lots of big lakes in order to get that surface water. They're having all those problems, right? Dallas growing and whatnot. Really interesting stuff. Would they be able to apply from the Texas Water Board, Region J,
For the repairs as well.
for the repairs and
Yes.
the fixing on
Yes,
stuff like
absolutely.
that? Their coffers are full of money to give to y'all for that as well.
City of Brackett can do
And,
the same.
City of Rock, yeah. And so
Come out.
that's
Have we ever done that? I mean, have we,
No,
as
never.
a city or the?
the city
But ever
has
done it.
spent over $3 million in the last 2 years on their water system, but that was okay. So that's the very important part that I mentioned in the very beginning. The reason that this assistance is available to us is because we have kept up with our audits and everything that we're supposed to file. Because the reason that the city took so long to be able to fix their water system is because they did not have financial audits for umpteen years. They made a deal with the state to come in and say, okay, if you can get the last 7 years done, and then their administration worked through getting all of those audits done, and then they became available under Texas Water Development Board and other grant programs to get access to the funds. And that's why, you constantly see work being done on those water systems. So that is our next step. And there was a panel there that was Texas Water Development Board, TCEQ, the land office, and then FEMA, I believe, or yeah, FEMA was there. And so all of these all have different financing programs. They all have different arms and like reasons and time frames that you can use them. But the basis of all of that is that you're doing what you're supposed to do from a reporting level. And so we are doing that, and we'll be looking into where those systems are and how we get that money. And what's the time frame on that? From the time we say go, because that was the big question at this conference was, what does that look like? We need the money now. Well, we all need the money now. That's common in every aspect that we're working in. But it's an 18 to 36 month kind of period of once you say go, we're going to do this to dollars. The faster route's a bond election, but that has its own issues, which we've seen. And so, we're going to run down the path of figuring out all of those avenues and then, have those discussions.
I know that I had Greg and Dr. Hutchinson look into it a little bit. So right now, the grant that I was telling y'all about for this right here would be currently not available until 2025.
Yeah, it starts over. They're talking about the rolling grants here. So we actually have to get prepared, in the next couple of months to apply for those because it's a rolling grant system that opens up in January, closes in March, then they make their decisions.
Well, I think the idea of the Austin Chalk Well as a tool is probably sellable. I mean, I'd have to see. I think it'd be a really hard sell for people drinking water that they have a relationship with. Maybe that's a good way to put it. You know what I mean? We have a relationship. Yeah, a relationship with the water coming out of the ground, the lost water spring, all that stuff, right? I mean, it's tangible, it's real. I think people will take pride in drinking water here based off of knowing that it's coming out of that spring. Maybe a really hard sell to say we're just going to convert that over to complete drinking water from the Austin Chalk. But as a tool,
What's coming out of the Edwards? That's
Oh, I'm drinking different rainwater. You're drinking.
Yeah,
well, I know, but the correlation to the spring, you know what I'm saying? It's the same thing. So it is the same thing because when you turn the pump on, it drains the pond down. It's the same water. So at the end of the day, I think that it'd be a hard sell to say let's just convert it over to complete drinking water. But as a tool, I mean it's a legitimate argument. A really good idea, especially if we can get it paid for by grants, and then somehow use that with look. All our interest here is to our job. Everybody has a different job sitting at the table, but our job is to protect the association and protect that spring. That's our job. That's what we took an oath to do. That's what we have to do, right? And everybody has their roles. But if drilling an Austin Chalk well in combination with reducing leaks and working together to use that as a tool helps the spring flow, then I would be all for that personally. That's my personal testimony on it, opinion on it.
So just as a takeaway, what you'd like BJ and I to do is take back to the mud board and general manager exploring the use of an Austin Chalk well in some sort of fashion to mitigate the use of the current well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even if we supplement in the beginning,
Right.
does that make sense?
Yes.
Like, it doesn't have to be an automatic changeover, but like, you know, we can fill the pool off of it, or we can do something off of it, run it, do the
Yeah.
water test.
A tool is, I think that is the
Yeah,
best way to put it.
as a tool.
Yeah.
I wouldn't hit them with, we're gonna switch over tomorrow.
Right, yeah, as a tool, right. And the second is because now we're moving from groundwater, which is where our permit sits at this time. You would like us to explore conjunctive use with TCEQ, which works over surface water.
I think it's a great idea.
What I don't
Yeah.
get what you mean by that.
Okay, so when we draw from groundwater, that we are drawing on our permit from the water district.
Your wells,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Be a whole new permit.
In order to use surface water, that process, that permit, that authorization would come from TCEQ, because where you own that water that is beneath this ground here, when it goes into that creek, it's now owned by the state of Texas. So we would actually then have two permits in conjunctive use. We would have a groundwater permit, and we would have a TCEQ surface water permit. So we would have to explore a relationship with TCEQ, and what does that look like? And then there would be a whole set, as you mentioned, what does it look like downstream? What does it look like along the way? And so what I'm getting at is you would like us to explore what that looks like and report back as to how that would.
Yeah. And then if all else fails, we'll take Jason's approach and just doesn't matter. Let's just keep, we don't need any of it. It doesn't matter. 60 feet, 80 feet, doesn't matter. No, it comes right back.
That wasn't my point.
I'm joking. I know. I'm just joking. No,
I do have a question. So listening to all of what we've been talking about, if we took the conjunctive way and used that surface, we're using the excess, would that stop the water flow of being in the creek because we're going to use that water?
Well, and then that's part of the analysis that we would need to find out. And I think that's the path that we need to figure out is like, what is that effect, right?
Right.
Right now you're pumping, at 30, generally, you're coming 15 million gallons a day out of that, right? So last month, don't quote me on this, July, I think was 7 million gallons. So you would have used 1/2 day's production for the entire usage of the month. It's just the simple way what that looks like. So
Just to clarify, one of the things that we'll be able to do with the model when it's completed by the end of the year is actually simulate all these options.
Was that 1.5 days?
The Austin Chalk Well.
1.5 days of
operations
discharge?
of it, the conjunctive use operations of that. And I can then tie it back to what would the change at the flow at the gauge be? So I'll be able to answer all those questions quantitatively, which will help clarify the discussion while you're doing this work over the next few months. I'll be doing my stuff, and then we'll be in a much better position to cost things out and get a better understanding of what the benefits are, what the costs would be of all that, all the different options.
And I think it's going to take us several months to get kind of what it is that we have to do to even get to a point of being able to do that. So we'll be able to have a more vibrant conversation about what that actually looks like.
Well, and maybe in a couple, we're coming up on the end of the year. Maybe by the time that kind of gets sifted out, then some more of that data will come in and we can have another meeting talking about how all this stuff can come together.
And not to throw just another wrench in the pile here, but one thing that we have not explored and not talked about
Valve
is,
seating.
excuse me,
Valve seating.
I'm not going there. Yeah, I don't. I'm okay with.
If I don't laugh at least every 10 minutes, I start losing my focus.
Well, then get ready to laugh. So we haven't talked about using our gray water. We haven't talked about converting that gray. Like, I don't know what the excess is in production of water that we are using for the golf course currently. What is the excess and how much of that could be used to supplement as fresh drinking water? There were systems that were there
through reverse osmosis.
Well, it's not only reverse osmosis. There are several systems, but yes, we would use the best available technology. There are several, and they have systems that go from 50 water taps to 50,000 water taps. So, that's what I was shocked at. While I was at the conference, I went through the technical show, and, I just stopped at one of the booths, and they're like, yep, we take gray water and we put it back into drinking water. And I know this is done all over the country in
They do
different
it in Del
areas.
Rio.
Yeah. And so, but what I'm saying is that I was not aware that the technology was small enough to where you could go to a 50 tap system and be able to economically reverse the water into where it's usable.
I think I'll take the chalk water, bro.
Currently, right now, we haven't had an opportunity to use all that water because we have a new pump.
Yeah.
Because of that new pump, there's a lot of sediment that pump sits on, and we can't pump because it's clogging all of our. So I don't know. I could
Well,
not at this moment give you that answer.
Generally speaking, in the summertime, there is
We use
not.
it all.
We use it all.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
thought.
But now we're
You
talking
use
like
it all on the golf course.
Yeah, we use it all in the Gulf.
All
Yeah.
the gray water goes on the golf.
Only gray
now not
water.
only the gray water from
Yep.
here, but all
Oh,
of the
yeah.
gray
Yeah.
water from the
All the
city
city
as
too,
well.
yeah.
So,
They're getting those trucks.
Well, how many acre
Yeah.
feet you think we're talking about?
I don't know.
well,
The
let's
whole
look,
golf course. So
I
but
don't
let's
know how much it takes.
but let's
water
look
one
at
of
that.
those.
And Matt just brought up a good point. It's not just the fort's water. It's not
Yeah.
just the city's water. It's also the encampment at Del Rio for the National Guard. We're bringing that water in. We have other clients that Randy has been actively pursuing to bring in that bring us more water that we can handle. We have 80 acres, that we can store water there. Now,
Well,
in the summertime, I agree with you, John. In the summertime, it most likely would not be possible. But now, if you start talking about conjunctive use, and you have it's a three-headed dragon. Now you've got something that
but that would be very expensive to do that.
well, and
But
currently,
as a
but as
last option, because it's the end of the world.
there's a few people I'd like to send those 50 taps of pure water to.
I mean, it is something that can
I
be done,
mean,
but
you can sign my house up,
Yeah.
send it straight to my house.
And currently, our agreement states that we get all the effluent flow. So,
No, but it would be,
Yeah.
obviously there would have to be changes in the agreements. There would have to be changes in a lot of things. But there are ways to do that. And if we start, okay, we were talking about stacking things earlier, right? So let's start stacking this together. You are providing a service to a economically, an area that has an economic issue, okay? That opens you up to all other funding sources. You have a two entity system. The Texas Water Development Board loves when groups start working together. You're already working with the city. That relationship already exists. So you start putting all these things together, and your availability for different things is already there. And I'm not saying to not use I'm saying use as much gray water as you need. And that's what we need to figure out. That's part of the homework, the research. How much excess gray water do we have? What if we say, okay, we've got, whatever, 200 acre feet excess. Great. Is it economical? Maybe. Okay, what can we do to go get more gray water? We already have the plant. We haven't been knocking on doors asking for gray water. That's never
That's a
been.
sentence I never thought I'd hear.
We haven't.
it's thought. I mean, that's what we're here for. We talk about.
Yeah.
Like there's been a couple of good ideas coming from it.
A good
So.
analogy would be just go to Del Rio and you can see the plant itself.
Yeah.
Because I bike ride down there, so it's huge.
Field
It's a-
trip.
It's a part of the
Yeah.
El
Very
Paso.
proud of
system.
drinking the poo water.
No, I don't drink it. I have a well. My well.
You're a pumper.
My well smells like
Oh, yeah.
sulfur, so I want to put it out there. My well smells like sulfur, but I have a filtrated system that it takes all of that out And I drink that water like no tomorrow. So I don't think people, if they understood the sulfur smell and they understood that it's so easy to put that filtration system in,
Area.
I really don't think people would complain about that. I
Well,
really
and maybe
don't.
we can find other uses for it, but I mean,
Sure.
it's just another option
It is.
and another thing that we can do. And we have,
Yeah.
we've already sacrificed the land, for that. And so let's look
We
at what
should have
that
a
looks
plan.
like. Yeah.
You all have
Any
like
kind of
80
plan
acre
is good.
holding pond?
Yes.
If it goes through, we'll name it the Huey.
Yeah, that's actually a good.
No, 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 no,
That's a
no.
good nickname for it. I like it.
The Huey Pooey.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of people that like to tack my name under a sewer plan.
I don't think that's true.
Do you have
All right.
questions?
Any more questions?
Does anybody
Well,
have
a lot of good
anything
stuff
else?
to think about. I
So
think.
I've got, just to be clear, I've got 2 takeaways. Explore Austin shock and conjunctive use
Yes.
and come back to y'all.
Conjunctive use, you mean taking it from the spring?
Yes, the surface
Taking it
water.
from surface water.
When it starts.
Well, that's what I
But I'll
asked
wait.
him, Lisa.
Well, it's just about math. Try to,
Yeah.
it's just we.
to see,
It
to
doesn't mean
understand
doesn't mean
what
we're voting on it to do it.
Yeah, I
Just-
mean,
but
we're so far from
we
voting.
got to
Yeah.
keep getting to the point of having the
Still gotta
information.
talk to
you know?
I like
TCQ on
I like
that
the
one.
comment that you made earlier about unifying everybody, and it may be, I may think of this as Mayberry around here. I don't know. Maybe I'm Andy Griffith trying to heal everything, right? But if we did something with the city and say that we were able to put 2 wells in for y'all in the future, 2 wells in for them, and make it all work, and time to get the water lines are already underneath Highway 90. We tied it all together like a loop. You may be able to catch some ears, because if we could work together with this plan, you'd be surprised what they would come up with on this because of the science behind it. So not only with the spring involved, but 2 entities working together and combining everything together, the water systems. And then that would give us a total of 8 wells as backups in case of an emergency, which we would never need. But like I said, those were drilled 65 years ago.
But I mean, that's exactly in the financing sessions. They
Yeah.
said if you want financing from the government agencies, you work out a plan where you come to us with 2 or more entities, and you are at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And we already have that relationship. We're already doing it at the mud facility and for the sewage plant, wastewater plant. I'm not allowed to use words. Wastewater plant.
Who planned?
The Huey property. Trying to get a laugh.
He doesn't like it.
I want to thank y'all for
Yeah.
coming, brainstorming and
Thank you very much.
talking. Because I think as long as we're talking, we'll get somewhere. That's when we stop talking.
We're still working.
Yeah, thank y'all very much for coming.
Those guys right there that make a lot happen for us. So, thank you, Dr. Bill.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks, Dr.
Thank
thank you,
you.
Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks,
Mr.
Greg.
House.
Thank you, Miss BJ.
Have a
Feel
great
better,
weekend.
DJ. All right.
Go to the bar.
Yeah,
Concentrate on being efficient.
Bar's
Yeah.
open.
The bar's open.
thank you very much.
Are you running the bar or what?
We got one right here.